No one saw it coming. On an ordinary morning, the world came to a halt at the announcement made by Arthur Silva, the reclusive billionaire who rarely appeared in public. He summoned 10 young women for a challenge that felt like something out of a fairy tale, or a viral social experiment. But this was no joke. Whoever cultivated the most beautiful flower would earn the right to marry his only son, Lucas. The media went wild, and speculation erupted over the true motives behind such an unusual proposal. Behind the eccentricity, however, there was a calculated gaze. Arthur wasn't looking for a daughter-in-law with the perfect resume or appearance. He was looking for someone who knew how to cultivate. And cultivating, in this case, meant much more than planting a seed. It meant nurturing, waiting, not giving up when nothing bloomed. He was searching for something no amount of money could buy: character. Because time reveals more about a person than any interview ever could. And let's face it, in a world addicted to immediacy, who really has the patience to wait for a flower to bloom? The 10 young women, each with her own story, accepted the challenge without knowing how deeply it would change them. Some were there for fame, others for the promise of a luxurious life. But gradually, the quiet nature of the process began doing something none of them expected: revealing intentions, testing values, and stirring deep insecurities. And that's when the real competition began, not between them, but within each one. Because what seemed simple on the surface was about to become far more profound. Lucas wasn't the kind of heir to be swayed by his father's whims. When he first heard Arthur's plan, his reaction was a mix of shock and disbelief. "Pick a wife through a flower contest," he said, almost laughing. To him, it was theater, an unnecessary spectacle. And more than that, it was a direct invasion of his freedom. Lucas wanted to live life on his own terms, unchained by the expectations of an empire built on control and tradition. But Arthur, like any billionaire used to moving pieces on a board, knew how to negotiate. He didn't use commands. He used something more seductive: the promise of freedom. He told his son this would be his final interference. One last attempt to offer what, in his view, Lucas didn't yet know he needed. After that, Lucas would be free. No pressure, no conditional inheritance, no ties. That offer struck a nerve. Because sometimes, the idea of peace is more persuasive than any fortune. Still, Lucas entered the game as if walking on broken glass. With skepticism, but also with a seed of curiosity he hadn't meant to plant. He didn't believe in the kind of love his father tried to script, nor in the candidate's intentions. But something about the proposal unsettled him. Maybe it was the courage to say no to it all, or maybe it was the fear that, by saying no, he might also be closing the door to something he didn't even know he was searching for. And so the challenge began, heavy with tension and distrust, on both sides. Arthur Silva's mansion looked like a movie set that day. Luxury cars pulled up one by one, and out stepped perfectly styled young women. High heels, expensive perfumes, eyes trained to impress. It was as if they had just walked out of an elite showroom. They exchanged strategically sweet greetings, already eyeing one another as rivals before even stepping through the grand doors. The challenge had barely started, and the air was already thick with veiled competition and razor-sharp smiles. But everything changed when Clara arrived. She didn't come in a luxury car, nor did she wear a dress designed by famous names. Her hair was simply tied back, her shoes worn by time, but there was something about her that none of the others had: authenticity. Clara wasn't trying to be someone else. And that alone made an impact. Where others used glitter to stand out, she stood out in silence. Where others were polished, Clara was whole. The truth is, in a world that rewards appearances, someone who carries truth in their gaze can be deeply unsettling. Clara didn't stand out because she tried. She stood out because she was different. She was like a note that didn't belong in the melody, yet somehow gave meaning to the entire song. And though no one said it out loud, they all noticed. The most unlikely among them might be the only one holding something truly rare. And that silent discomfort began to grow within each of them, like an unwanted root in the soil of vanity. Arthur personally handed out the challenge: a pot filled with fertile soil, and a single rare seed. There were no instructions, only a phrase spoken with a steady gaze: The most beautiful flower will bloom for the one who knows how to wait, care, and trust. It was a test disguised as simplicity, yet rich with meaning. For 30 days, each of them had to water, observe, nurture, and perhaps the hardest part, resist the anxiety of wanting quick results. Because in that place, time could not be rushed. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury and parties, now felt like a quiet greenhouse of intentions. Some contestants bought special fertilizers. Others hired online botanical consultants. After all, the prize was marriage to the heir of an empire. No one was there to lose. Clara, without access to such resources, chose a different path. She talked to her plant. Every morning, she sat by the pot, shared her memories, her sorrows, and even hummed lullabies. It might sound strange, but sometimes, what makes a seed grow isn't just water. Days passed, and the challenge stopped being botanical. It became emotional. Some girls broke down at the absence of sprouts. Others began to suspect the seed, the soil, the process. The silence of the plant became a mirror, reflecting impatience, pride, and insecurity. And amid this invisible tension, a haunting question began to take root. What if the test wasn't about the flower at all? What if what was being evaluated was something much more invisible, much more human? The kind of doubt that couldn't be answered with fertilizer, only with intention. Clara hadn't come for glory. She didn't dream of a glamorous wedding or magazine covers. She came from the countryside, where the sun scorches the skin and life teaches you early the weight of responsibility. For her, this challenge was a chance, perhaps the only one, to change her family's fate. Her mother was ill. Her little sisters didn't know what it felt like to have a new toy. Clara didn't have time to romanticize love. She was there out of urgency, survival, and that gave her a silent strength no one else understood. While some girls chatted about makeup, travel destinations, and designer brands, Clara thought about medicine, overdue bills, and sleepless nights. Every time she looked at the pot, she didn't see a flower, she saw hope. That plant wasn't just a plant. It was her ticket out of poverty. And maybe that's why she cared for it with such devotion and heart. It wasn't about winning a game. It was about saving a life. Several, actually. And that kind of motivation can't be bought or faked. The mansion, with all its marble and crystal details, didn't intimidate Clara. Because those who've lived through droughts, through real pain and loss, don't get shaken by superficialities. She was the outsider in that luxurious world. But slowly, without even realizing it, she was becoming the only truly alive presence there. Because someone who carries truth in their heart doesn't need to raise their voice. And as the days passed, the contrast between her and the other greenhouse flowers became impossible to ignore. That night, the mansion looked even more golden. Candelabras lit the long dining table where all the contestants were gathered. But amid the rehearsed laughter and empty toasts, Clara became the silent target. Her simple manners, her accent, the modest dress she wore, everything about her seemed to make others uncomfortable, especially those who only knew how to feel superior by making someone else feel small. It didn't take long for the sideways glances to turn into comments disguised as jokes. And right there, fork in hand and pride bruised, Clara realized the challenge was going to be much bigger than just growing a flower. Victoria, the favorite among the favorites, went beyond subtle scorn. With a cruel smile on her lips, she approached Clara holding a glass of wine. A slip. Not at all. It was intentional. The liquid spilled like blood over the only dress Clara owned. The silence that followed was deafening. No one laughed, but no one stepped in either. That's how social cruelty works. It hides behind the silence of those who just watch. Clara stood up slowly, without yelling, without crying. But something inside her cracked. Because when dignity is wounded, it doesn't make noise, it grows. Most would have given up right then. Slipped away quietly. But Clara, her face burning with shame, stayed. She washed the dress by hand and slept in borrowed sheets, given to her by a kind housemaid. Because those who've been through real humiliation in life learn to turn pain into fuel. And that's exactly what she did. Every mocking word, every fake laugh, every stain on the fabric. Clara turned it all into roots. And what begins as silent roots can one day bloom in the most surprising way. Lucas noticed more than he let on. While the other contestants fought for attention as if they were on stage, he was drawn to the one who wasn't trying to shine. It was impossible to ignore what happened at dinner. The wine stain, the discomfort in Clara's eyes, the absence of support. It struck something inside him. Perhaps because, despite all his wealth, Lucas also knew what it felt like to be out of place, trapped by expectations he never asked for. And that's when the silent connection between them began. No promises, no grand gestures, just small, quiet signs. The next morning, Clara found a folded linen handkerchief placed on the rocking chair, with a small note tucked inside. The most beautiful flower grows in the toughest soil. There was no signature, but she knew. It was from him. Lucas didn't need to make bold statements to show support. Just being there, quietly, was enough. He started showing up in the same corridors where Clara watered her plant, striking up short conversations, sharing small stories. It was as if someone finally saw her, truly saw her. But Lucas also had his limits. He couldn't openly defy his father's game or show obvious favoritism. So, he chose the path of subtle presence. A disapproving glance when he heard cruel jokes. A quiet, knowing smile when Clara began to doubt herself. And it was exactly this kind of care, not loud, not heroic, that began to soften her defenses. Because sometimes, what heals a wounded soul isn't a grand rescue. It's the quiet presence of someone who stays, even when they have every reason to walk away. It was the middle of the night when Clara heard the doorknob turn slowly. The door opened without warning, revealing Vittoria, standing tall, dressed in arrogance from head to toe. She wasn't there to talk. She came to intimidate. She closed the door behind her, crossed her arms, and unleashed her venom. That Clara didn't belong there, that she would never be chosen, that she was just another poor girl reaching for a world that was never meant for her. Her words were thrown like daggers, sharpened by the certainty of superiority. But Clara, sitting on the edge of the bed, didn't flinch. She didn't yell back or try to justify herself. She simply looked Vittoria in the eyes, steady and calm, and said, "You may have all of this, but you don't have peace." That made Vittoria hesitate for a second. Because what she saw in Clara wasn't weakness, it was an ancient strength, the kind born from surviving worse humiliations and learning how to keep standing. And for someone used to winning through fear, that was a sharp blow. Vittoria left the room without getting what she came for, the break. And Clara stayed behind, alone, but unshaken. Because there are battles that don't need an audience. And true dignity doesn't need to defend itself, it stands on its own. Clara knew that kind of attack wasn't about her, but about the other girl's insecurity. Because empty people shout the loudest when they feel they're losing control. And as Clara lay back down, what Vittoria didn't know was that night, she hadn't weakened an enemy. She had strengthened a woman. One who, even exhausted, refuses to be silenced. It was always after the mansion fell silent that the garden found its voice. There, among stone benches and the scent of damp earth, Clara and Lucas would meet like two people escaping, not from each other, but from the noise of the world. There was no script, no promises, just conversations that unfolded slowly, as if each word gently washed their souls. Lucas spoke of a lonely childhood, of growing up surrounded by luxury but starving for real affection. Clara, in turn, shared memories of the countryside, of nights lit by oil lamps and of a mother who smiled even when the plate was empty. It was under the timid light of the moon that Lucas began to shed the expectations he'd inherited. Listening to Clara, he rediscovered the value of simple things. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the joy of dancing in the rain, the pride of earning something with your own hands. And Clara, as she listened to Lucas, saw that behind that powerful last name was a man carrying invisible scars. They didn't talk about love. Not yet. They talked about loss, fear, and forgotten dreams. And maybe that's how love truly begins, where the fear of being real ends. Their connection wasn't built through grand gestures, but through the quiet pauses that didn't need explaining. Through looks that said, "I get you," without speaking a word. It was as if the garden, invisible to the others, became a sacred space just for them, where masks fell away, stories intertwined, and the seed of something far deeper than passion began to grow. And even though neither knew what might come next, both found themselves wishing those nights would never end. As the days passed, one by one, the other girls' pots began to bloom. Tiny buds turned into bursts of color, petals displayed like trophies. With each new flower, all eyes turned to Clara, not with admiration, but with confusion. Her pot remained empty, as if nothing had ever been planted. And over time, the silence of the soil began to echo within her. Clara, who had once nurtured with faith, began to question, did I fail? Was I foolish to believe? The doubt didn't come just from the dry pot, but from the smiles of the others, now sharper, more confident, as if they could already taste victory. She tried not to let it get to her, but inside, insecurity spread like a weed. She watered with less hope, observed with more discouragement, spoke less. Even Lucas noticed the absence of light in her eyes. Because when you give everything you have to something, and it gives nothing back, the feeling of failure seeps in slowly, like a crack in solid ground. Still, Clara didn't give up. She kept watering, kept talking to the seed, kept waiting. And maybe that's the hardest part, continuing when everything around you says it won't work. Because persevering in silence takes a kind of faith that can't be bought or taught. It's a daily, exhausting, nearly invisible choice. And in that choice, even without realizing it, Clara was revealing exactly what the challenge was meant to test. Not who could grow the prettiest flower, but who had the most resilient soul. The next morning, the breakfast hall was filled with the smell of sweet pastries and bitter remarks. Between calculated laughs and porcelain teacups, all eyes turned once again to Clara and her still lifeless pot. Maybe the seed smelled poverty and gave up, one of the girls whispered, not even bothering to hide her contempt. The whole table laughed, not at the joke, but at the easy target. Clara, her spoon frozen midair, felt the weight of those words like lead. It was the third time that week. And repeated humiliation never becomes routine. It always hurts. Lucas, seated beside his father, didn't stay silent. He set his cup down, raised his eyes, and said firmly, sometimes the rarest flowers take the longest to bloom. But when they do, no one forgets. The room fell silent. It wasn't an attack, it was a quiet, precise defense. His words didn't just hush the laughter, they exposed the cowardice behind it. And for Clara, hearing those words felt like receiving a single drop of water in the middle of a desert. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make it through one more day. The public humiliation became a secret fuel. Clara left the room with her head high and her heart, though bruised, stronger. Funny how sometimes the support of just one person can rebalance everything inside us. She knew the flower hadn't bloomed yet, but she was starting to realize that maybe the blooming had to happen inside her first. And while the others flaunted their flowers to the world, Clara, in silence, was nurturing something far too big to fit in a pot. The phone rang on a hot, airless afternoon, and Clara answered with her heart in her throat. On the other end, her youngest sister's trembling voice. Mom's been hospitalized, she got worse. The room began to spin. The news hit like a punch to the chest. Her mother, her strength, her root, was now fighting for her life, and the treatment she needed cost more than the family could ever hope to gather. In that moment, the flower challenge stopped being symbolic. It became a matter of survival. Clara couldn't afford to lose. Not now. The emotional pressure multiplied. Every minute in the mansion now felt like a minute beside a hospital bed. She stared at the pot like it held her mother's healing inside. Her anxiety was tangled with guilt. Being here, far away, when she longed to be beside the woman who had given her everything. But quitting wasn't an option. Losing would mean leaving her sisters orphans, of care, of security, of hope. And so Clara began to water the plant with more than just water. She watered it with tears. With silent promises that she wouldn't return empty-handed. Lucas noticed something was broken in her gaze. He tried to ask, but Clara only said, I'm fine. A choked lie. But he respected the silence. He understood that some pain runs so deep, it needs space, not questions. And as the garden around them bloomed bright and alive, Clara's pot remained empty. But inside her, a war was raging. It wasn't just about winning the challenge. It was about saving the only woman who had taught her how to keep standing, even when life offered no flowers. That night, Clara couldn't hold it in any longer. She walked out barefoot, silently, into the garden, where everything seemed too calm to match the storm inside her chest. She sat on the damp ground, hugged her knees, and cried like someone who no longer had the strength to pretend. It wasn't a beautiful cry. It was broken, raw, full of gasps. The kind of cry that only comes when your soul overflows with helplessness. The pot still sat there, unchanged. And to Clara, it felt like a mirror of her life. Effort without response, love without return. Lucas found her like that. He didn't speak right away. He just sat beside her, on the same cold ground. He didn't offer advice or try to console her with empty words. He simply stayed. After a few minutes, she began to speak. Softly, through sobs. She told him everything. About the mother who always managed to put food on the table, even when there was none. About the little sisters who still believed Clara could save them. About the pain of being far away while the woman who gave her everything fought for just a little more life. For the first time, Clara let her armor fall. And Lucas saw the woman behind the strength. He held her hand gently, like someone who knows that words don't fix what's deep. But in that gesture, Clara felt a rare kind of shelter, the kind that doesn't try to fix you, but stays with you anyway. And in that moment, for the first time, she allowed herself not to be strong. Because sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit that it hurts. And in that garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and one pot still bare, something invisible began to grow between them, something no seed in the world could imitate. The next day, Lucas made a decision. After hearing everything Clara had shared in the garden, he couldn't pretend not to know anymore. He quietly used his influence, made a few calls, and found a way to fund her mother's treatment, without anyone else finding out. When he told Clara, he expected gratitude or relief. But what he got was an uncomfortable silence, followed by a steady gaze. "Thank you, but I can't accept it." The answer hit like a shock. Not out of pride, but out of dignity. Clara didn't want to be rescued. She wanted to win. For her, accepting that help would mean invalidating her fight. It would be like admitting that, in the end, everything depended on the compassion of someone more privileged. And that crushed her inside. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the gesture. She did, deeply. But she came from a place where women learn early to swallow pain with beans and cornbread, to stand up on their own even when there's no ground beneath them. Clara wanted to win by merit, not pity. She wanted to show her sisters, and herself, that it was still possible to achieve something without owing anyone anything. Lucas stood somewhere between respect and frustration. He understood, but it still hurt. He only wanted to help, to ease that unbearable weight she carried alone. But he also admired her resolve even more. Because it wasn't about money, it was about worth. Clara didn't want shortcuts. She wanted to prove that the impossible was possible, even for those born on the margins. And that kind of integrity, though harsh, is rare. He didn't insist. But he stayed even closer to her. Because sometimes, the most powerful kind of help is simply continuing to believe, even when the other says no. Days later, Clara received an unexpected call. Her mother had been transferred to a top-tier hospital, with access to advanced tests, specialists, and a room worthy of dignity. Her sisters had been taken in by a local social program, receiving education, food, and care. None of it was announced. No cameras, no applause. It was as if an invisible hand had touched her family's fate and changed the course of their story. When Clara hung up the phone, her legs gave out. For a few seconds, she couldn't breathe. It wasn't relief, it was a miracle. Deep down, she knew where that miracle had come from. Lucas. Even though he never said a word, Clara felt his presence in the quiet unfolding of everything. He didn't force his help. He waited. and helped anyway, in a way that honored her dignity. It was a gesture of unspoken love, the rarest kind. And it moved Clara in ways she couldn't explain. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, harder to name. As if, for the first time in her life, someone saw her completely. But the biggest change didn't happen in hospitals or paid bills. It happened inside her. Clara began to walk differently, her shoulders less tense, her eyes more steady. The anguish no longer lived in her voice. For the first time in a long while, she could sleep without guilt. And each time she watered her plant, still without any sign of life, she did it with new intent. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about everything that had already bloomed within her. And when the transformation happens from the inside out, the flower always comes. Eventually. The sparkle of flowers in the other pots was no longer enough to settle the growing tension. Each day, Clara's name carried more weight within the mansion, and that stirred resentment. Especially in Vittoria, who couldn't stand losing the spotlight to someone who, in her eyes, shouldn't even be there. One humid afternoon, in the tea room, she quietly gathered the other girls. With a cold smile, she laid it out. "It's time we cut this extra from the script." And so, the conspiracy began. The plan wasn't dirty to the eye, but it was cruel to the soul. They would start with words. Whispers in the halls, rumors laced with false concern. Malicious comments disguised as worry. "Do you think she's pretending? Maybe she didn't even plant anything." The goal was clear: corrode Clara from the inside out, make her doubt herself enough to give up voluntarily. They knew that direct humiliation no longer worked. Now it was about injecting doubt and mistrust like a slow-working poison. Vittoria led everything like a strategist disguised as a friend. She fed egos, made subtle promises, forged fragile alliances built on the fear of losing. Because when someone like Clara begins to threaten the top, those who live off appearances panic. What they didn't realize was that Clara had already been crushed by life once, and survived. But even so, the environment began to close in around her like an invisible cage. And sometimes, the most dangerous pain is the kind that comes from within. What Vittoria didn't realize was that the mansion's walls have ears, and sometimes, watchful eyes. As she detailed every part of her plan with her accomplices, the half-open door of the tea room betrayed her. Maddalena, the housekeeper, stood in the hallway. Not out of curiosity, out of duty. Always silent, always unnoticed, Maddalena was one of those women nobody sees. And precisely because of that, she saw everything. She heard every word, every veiled threat, every laugh dripping with poison. And what she heard wasn't gossip, it was cruelty. Maddalena knew Clara. From day one, she'd watched her humble steps, the way she folded linens with gratitude, how she asked permission just to exist. She knew how to recognize a good soul. And, just as clearly, she knew how to spot the kind of person who smiles with cold eyes. It wasn't the first time she'd seen power games in that house, but this time was different. Clara wasn't just being excluded, she was being hunted. And that awakened something inside Maddalena, the urgency to protect what is right. She didn't say anything then. She simply backed away quietly, like someone who had seen nothing. But inside, her mind was already made up. Not all strength belongs to those who shout. Sometimes, the greatest power lives in those who act at the right time, without making noise. And Maddalena, with her silent steps and just heart, would begin to move behind the scenes. Because if life had taught her one thing, it was this: the truth might take its time, but it always finds a way to bloom. Clara entered her room at the end of the day, tired, but with a slightly lighter heart after the quiet conversations in the garden. But it only took 2 steps for the ground to vanish beneath her feet. The scent of water in the air didn't come from rain. Her clothes were soaked, drenched and thrown on the floor like rags. The bedspread was torn. And on the nightstand, an old photo, her with her mother and sisters, now ripped in half. On top of the photo, a note, its handwriting shaky and cruel. "Maybe it's time to go back where you never should have left." She stood there, frozen, as if time had stopped. She didn't cry, not right away. The pain was too deep to turn into tears so quickly. It felt as if someone hadn't just torn a picture, but her entire story. The dress she wore on special days was soaked, stained with mud. The closet had been rummaged through. Nothing had been stolen, but everything had been violated. It was a message. Clara understood. It was an attempt to shatter what little strength she had left. To make her quit. Quietly. Humiliated. Without leaving a trace. But what the culprits didn't know, or pretended not to know, was that Clara had already lost everything once, and still managed to start over. Yes, it hurt. Deeply. But it also reignited something ancient inside her, the instinct to resist. In that moment, Clara knew she couldn't just survive anymore. She had to win. For herself. For her mother. For every Clara who's treated as disposable just because she dared to dream outside the place where she was put. And from that moment on, her silence became a promise. That night, in a torn-up room and with her soul in pieces, Clara sat on the floor and closed her eyes. There, in the stillness between one sob and the next, came the memories. The smell of fresh brewed coffee. The rooster's song at dawn. The laughter of her sisters running barefoot through the dirt yard. Her mother's voice, steady as a root, saying, "You're a child of dry earth, girl, but you were born to bloom where no one expects." That hurt and healed at the same time. Because the memory of the Sorteo wasn't just nostalgia, it was soil. It was root. It was strength buried deep in the chest. Clara began folding her wet clothes carefully, one by one. Like someone cleaning a wound with gentleness, not anger. She took the torn photo and taped it back together. Not because she believed it would erase the damage, but because it was her way of saying, "I'm still here." There were no screams, no despair. There was dignity. And dignity, when tested, reveals a kind of courage you don't learn in schools or marble halls. It's something you learn from drought, from lack, from the daily fight not to let your spirit die of thirst. Though shaken, she looked at herself in the mirror and took a deep breath. The reflection was of someone who had already been tested by many pains. But now, something was changing. The tear was no longer defeat, it was baptism. Clara wasn't just resisting. She was remaking herself. Because when a woman remembers where she came from and what she's made of, no strength in the world can erase her. And that night, in the very room where they tried to silence her, Clara decided, she would no longer be just a survivor. She would be a root no one could uproot. The final day was approaching, and Clara's pot remained the same. Silent, dry, empty. There was no sign of life, no promise of a bud. The other girls had already placed their flowers proudly on the mansion's veranda. Colorful, vibrant, triumphant. The contrast was cruel. Clara looked at her pot and tasted the bitter flavor of helplessness. She had given everything, care, hope, tears. But the soil remained mute. And the feeling was devastating, as if all her effort had been in vain. Every passing hour seemed to mock her. The candidates walked back and forth in their flawless dresses, laughing loudly, as if victory were already sealed. And even Lucas, who stayed by her side, no longer knew what to say. The silence between them spoke louder than any word. Time was running out. Clara began to doubt everything. The seed, the challenge, herself. Had she done something wrong? Had she never had a chance from the start? The weight of injustice was almost unbearable. But even amid the pain, she did not break. She kept watering. Every morning, she still knelt before the pot. Not out of blind faith, but out of honor. Because if there was one thing the Sorteo had taught her, it was that some seeds take much longer to break through, but when they do, no one can stop them. And even with tear-filled eyes, she whispered to the soil, "If it's going to grow, let it be when no one believes anymore." Because deep down, Clara knew, sometimes, apparent failure is just the beginning of a much greater answer. Clara was sitting in the garden, elbows on her knees, her gaze lost in her own pot. The sun no longer warmed, it seemed heavy. That's when she heard slow, firm footsteps on the grass. It was Mr. Antonio, the mansion's gardener. A man of few words, calloused hands, and eyes that had seen more than most could bear. He approached with his usual calm and, without asking a word, just looked at her pot. Then he sat beside her and said simply, "Every plant has its time. Hurry is the enemy of the root." Clara stared, confused. How could she stay calm when everything seemed lost? Antonio took a handful of soil between his fingers and continued, "Some seeds sleep for days, others, weeks. And some only wake up after feeling pain, cold, or loneliness. The most beautiful flower I've ever seen took so long to bloom that I almost gave up on it. But when it did, it was as if the whole garden bowed down to it." That wasn't just a metaphor. It was a lesson time had taught him with patience and care. A lesson Clara needed to hear. The gardener's words didn't erase her anguish, but they rekindled a spark inside her. Maybe the problem wasn't the pot, nor the soil. Maybe her flower simply hadn't found the right time to bloom yet. And in that moment, between the silence of the afternoon and the passing breeze, Clara chose to keep waiting. Not out of stubbornness, but out of wisdom. Because there's a quiet strength in those who decide to trust, even when everything seems to say otherwise. The big day had arrived. The candidates stood lined up in the main hall, each proudly holding their blooming pot. The room smelled of expensive perfume, tension, and rivalry disguised as smiles. Clara, hands steady, carried her empty pot. The whole hall seemed to breathe slower as she walked. The absence of flowers was visible, and for many, unforgivable. Before she could even take her place, Vittoria stepped forward, as if the moment belonged to her by right. And with a sweet but venomous voice, she announced, "Clara, dear, won't you show us your progress?" The girl's suppressed laughter echoed through the hall like invisible thorns. Clara felt her face burn, not from shame of failure, but from humiliation at being exposed. Every look cast at her felt like her story, her fight, her effort, was reduced to a pot of dry soil. Vittoria, with her triumphant smile, knew exactly where to press. Maybe it's best to leave her out. This is a pageant, not a pity party. And that cut deep. Not for the phrase, but for the silent complicity of those who watched and said nothing. Clara, however, did not bow her head. She took a deep breath, lifted the pot, and walked to the center as if carrying more than soil. She carried her truth. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She just stood there, a woman refusing to give up her dignity even when the whole world tried to steal it. And at that moment, the hall didn't know it, but it witnessed something greater than a presentation. The birth of a force measured not by flowers, but by courage. And what came next, no one was ready to see. Before the awkward silence returned to fill the room, Lucas stepped forward. His eyes, once observant, now burned with indignation. He didn't shout, he didn't make a scene, but the firmness in his voice silenced all the laughter. "You're confusing beauty with appearance, and competition with cruelty." The impact was immediate. No one dared to respond. Lucas looked at Clara, as if apologizing for all she'd been forced to endure there, then turned to his father. "If this is what this challenge represents, I don't want any part of it." Lucas's words thundered through the clear sky. For the first time, someone from the Silva family bloodline challenged the theater of appearances sustaining the competition. He walked to Clara without hesitation, took her hand, and said loudly, simply, and firmly, "You don't have to go through this. Come with me." The reaction was mixed: shock, scorn, envy. But for Clara, it was as if a door had opened right in the middle of shame. She was no longer a target. She was someone chosen, for who she was, not for what her pot lacked. They left the hall together, under looks of astonishment and indignation, but also silent admiration. And in that moment, Clara realized that for the first time, she was not alone facing injustice. Lucas didn't save her, he recognized her. And there is something deeply transforming in being truly seen, especially when the whole world tries to erase your presence. As they walked down the corridor toward the garden, the weight of failure began to change into something else. A new strength. As if the story was about to turn, even without flowers in sight. The night was clear, silent, almost conspiratorial. The sky above the garden seemed embroidered with stars, and Clara, still with a racing heart, walked beside Lucas without knowing exactly where to go, but certain she was in the right place. He led her to the same bench where so many conversations had begun, where shy laughter and painful secrets had been shared. Now, there were no words, only silence. There was a gentle tension, as if the entire universe was holding its breath. Clara looked up at the sky. Lucas looked at her. Then he spoke. Quietly, but firmly. I didn't fall in love with you despite the empty pot. I fell in love because of it. Because only someone with your courage would wait for something to bloom when everything around said it wouldn't. Clara felt tears welling up. It wasn't a compliment. It was recognition. Lucas didn't see her as a sad story to be saved, but as a woman who had won battles he barely imagined. He touched her hand gently and whispered, "No matter what happens tomorrow, I've already made my choice. It's you." The kiss came without hurry. No audience, no dramatic soundtrack, no grand promises. It was a sincere kiss, one of those that seemed to seal a silent pact between two tired souls, but still willing to love. For a moment, Clara forgot the competition, the humiliation, the empty pot. She was there, whole. For the first time, loved for who she was, not for what she could give. And while the stars kept shining above, something inside her, without her realizing it, began to bloom. The next morning, Clara woke up to birdsong, but the lightness of the night before was gone. The kiss under the stars still lived in her memory like a refuge, but now her heart carried a weight, not of doubt, but of responsibility. On one side, there was Lucas, with his calm voice, sincere gaze, and gesture of taking her out of that hall as if returning her dignity. On the other side, her mother undergoing treatment, her little sisters with hopeful eyes. And a promise Clara had made to herself. She would not go home empty-handed. It was a dilemma no flower could solve. Loving Lucas was like finding water in the desert. But giving in to that love now felt like betraying everything that had brought her this far. Clara hadn't entered the competition to win a romance. She had entered because of real life, overdue bills, medicine that couldn't be missed, the interrupted childhood of her sisters. And even with her heart on fire, she knew. Feelings are beautiful, but the mission was urgent. Time would not wait. And she couldn't afford to be distracted. So, in the garden where it all began, Clara stepped back a few paces. Lucas tried to understand, tried to hold her hand once more, but she, with a sweet yet painful smile, simply said, "I chose to. But, for now, I have to choose them." It wasn't rejection. It was sacrifice. And there is something profoundly noble in those who know how to postpone love for a greater purpose. Her heart ached, yes. But now it beat with even clearer strength. And maybe, just maybe, that renunciation was the greatest act of love she could make. The clock struck late afternoon when Clara was surprised by a note slid under the door. "Meet me at the greenhouse. Alone." Signed, Vittoria. The same woman who had always treated her like less now wanted privacy. Clara went, not out of fear, but curiosity. She found Vittoria with a calculated smile, dressed as if she didn't expect to hear no. On the table, a black folder. Inside it, $50,000 in fresh bills. Vittoria said bluntly, "It's simple. You leave the contest, stay away from Lucas, and all this is yours. Enough money to save your mother, educate your sisters, and disappear." Clara felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. That offer was the portrait of elegant cruelty. It wasn't just an offer, it was a trap with expensive perfume. Vittoria knew where it hurt, and that's exactly where she pressed. For a second, Clara felt the power of that temptation, the end of all anguish in one envelope. The quick solution she never had. But alongside the temptation came revulsion. Vittoria didn't want to help. She wanted to buy her surrender, erase her story, silence her dignity with cash. It was money, yes. But it smelled like defeat. She closed the folder slowly, looked Vittoria in the eyes and said, "You still don't get it. I'm not here for money. I'm here for justice." And she left, leaving the envelope untouched. Her heart raced, not with fear, but with resolve. Clara knew that paying bills with dirty money cost too much. Because peace of mind can't be bought. She would return to her empty room, with no guarantees, but with her head held high. And little did Vittoria know, by trying to silence Clara with dollars, she only strengthened the root of a flower that, though invisible, was already about to break through the soil. Clara returned to the room with steady steps, but inside, something gnawed at her. The folder with $50,000 still seemed heavy in her hands, even after leaving it behind. She sat on the bed, looked at the ceiling and wondered, what if this was the only chance? Her mother's treatment was far from over, her sisters still depended on her, and the pot remained empty. Everything seemed to point toward the easy way. The money would solve everything quickly and quietly. No one would know. She could simply disappear, return home a heroine. Outwardly, she resisted. But inside, she was at war. Then her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, with that slow accent full of simple truths. Better to sleep hungry than to lie down with a sold soul. Clara remembered the stories she heard sitting on the porch at home, how her grandmother, even in the drought, refused alms that came with humiliation. We are poor, but we're clean. And that's worth more than gold. At that moment, Clara understood, it wasn't just about money. It was about not allowing anyone to turn her pain into a bargaining chip. It was about keeping alive the root that always sustained her truth. She stood up with tears in her eyes, but her chest firm. She opened the closet, took her simplest dress, the same one Vittoria had stained, and hung it carefully as if it were armor. Because it was. Clara knew she would refuse the offer again, as many times as necessary. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And those with strong origins, even when shaken, don't fall. The great temptation wasn't the folder full of bills, it was the chance to abandon herself. And she chose, once again, to stay faithful to what brought her this far. In the mansion's imposing office, Arthur Silva watched everything through strategically placed cameras. Every fake smile, every suspicious whisper, every disdainful gesture passed through his watchful eyes. He was not just the creator of the challenge, but a master of appearances and strategies. He knew the game was much bigger than everyone saw, and he also saw the courage Clara carried, the dignity that resisted even without flowers in the pot. While others schemed and deceived, he quietly kept that secret. Arthur watched with a mix of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction at seeing his plan working in unexpected ways, creating a tension that revealed true values. But also concern, because Clara wasn't just another pawn on the board. She had a strength that bothered, that challenged the power he represented. He realized the challenge was not just about growing a flower, but about recognizing who really had the courage to bloom amid the storm. And Clara, against all odds, was blossoming in her essence. Without making a fuss, Arthur decided to act. Not immediately, but at the right moment, he would use everything he had seen to change the rules of the game. He didn't need shouted proofs. Those cameras were silent witnesses to a truth no empty pot could hide. And amid so much falseness, Clara's honesty shone like a beacon, showing that the true winner might not be the one who grew the most beautiful flower, but the one who isn't afraid to be whole. And what came next would be an unexpected twist. Even faced with the temptations crossing her path, Clara held firm to her decision. The dirty money Vittoria offered wasn't just currency, it was a trap meant to silence her voice and erase her story. She knew that accepting it would be like giving up her identity, like throwing away all the sweat and struggle that had brought her this far. Even when whispers of doubt circled around her, and the weight of exhaustion threatened to overcome her, Clara chose to resist. Because her strength didn't come from showy flowers, but from the quiet courage to remain true to herself. On lonely nights, when fatigue hit hardest, she remembered the promise she made to her mother and sisters. To keep going was an act of love greater than any financial reward. It was the way she proved that, despite all the hardships, no one could buy her worth. Clara knew she might not be the winner of the challenge, but she was already a winner of her own life. And that victory, silent and invisible to many, was the one that mattered most. Lucas watched, amazed, at that unquenchable fire. He didn't need to say a word. Clara spoke with her eyes, with the steady way she tended the empty vase. Her choice went beyond the mere game of appearances. It was a silent scream against corruption, injustice, against everything that tried to diminish who she was. And so, even facing the impossible, Clara kept going, not for glory, but for dignity. And along the way, she discovered that sometimes resistance is the most powerful way to bloom. The silence in the library was heavy, almost tangible, when Lucas finally faced his father. Arthur, with his cold, calculating gaze, expected empty arguments, convenient words. But Lucas didn't come to negotiate. His voice, firm and full of conviction, cut through the air. "Father, I choose Clara. Not because of the challenge or the flowers. I choose her because I saw courage, dignity, and truth where others saw only appearances." The declaration hit like an unexpected blow, forcing the patriarch to rethink not just the game, but the values he upheld. Arthur didn't show it on the surface, but Lucas knew his father felt the weight of those words. "You're throwing away everything we've built," he snapped, his voice heavy with disapproval. But Lucas didn't back down. "Building on falsehood isn't building. I want a life with meaning, not a stage for vanity. Clara showed me what it means to truly fight. And that's worth more than any deal or tradition." In that moment, the confrontation between father and son was not just about a contest or an arranged marriage, it was about a future Lucas was ready to redefine. With the courage he had always nurtured, Lucas made it clear there was no turning back. He didn't care what his father thought or expected. Choosing Clara was final, a milestone that would forever change the Silva family's dynamics. And while Arthur absorbed the shock, Lucas felt the weight of responsibility, and the lightness of someone who had chosen to follow his own path. Because sometimes, the greatest proof of love is to challenge power in order to be true to the heart. In the quiet of the room, Lucas looked at Clara with an intensity beyond words. He wasn't there to promise castles or bright futures, but to show what truly mattered, his soul. "If I have to, I'd give up everything. The fortune, the name, the status, everything to be by your side." The sincerity of that statement was like a fresh breeze breaking down walls of pride and mistrust. Because true love isn't measured by material goods, but by the courage to let go of what you have most to be together. He continued without hesitation, "I know what my family expects from me. I know abandoning all this might be seen as madness, weakness, or even betrayal. But I don't want a life where I have to hide who I am or who I love. I want to build something real, based on truth and respect." Clara heard those words with her heart racing, feeling that for the first time she was chosen not as a piece in a game, but as a whole person, with all that she is and can be. At that moment, Lucas was not just an heir, nor a pressured son. He was a man ready to rewrite his story, not for fortune, but for love. And Clara, her eyes shining, understood that no matter how hard the journey would be, she wouldn't be alone. Because love that demands sacrifice is the love that truly matters. And in that moment, they were beginning to write a chapter no empty vase could erase. Vittoria didn't give up. With a cold stare and a venomous smile, she devised a new trap for Clara, this time far crueler, a preview of judgment, in front of all the candidates and guests. The idea was simple, but devastating. To expose Clara to public ridicule, to strip away any trace of dignity before the final result. Vittoria wanted to turn the room into a courtroom, where Clara would be the condemned defendant without the right to defense. It was the peak of cruelty disguised as fair play. When the announcement was made, the atmosphere shifted. Whispered voices and exchanged glances filled the air, some full of malice, others of restrained pity. Clara felt the weight of expectation like a stone on her chest. Yet, even under that pressure, there was something different about her, a tense calm, a contained fire that wouldn't go out. She knew she couldn't run from this battle, but she wouldn't give up her soul so easily. And while Vittoria waited to savor the humiliation, Clara was already planning her own silent counterattack. Amid the tense room, surrounded by low voices and watchful eyes, Clara stood firm. Humiliation was a cruel game, but she already knew true power wasn't in unseen flowers, nor in the venomous words trying to bring her down. It was inside her, in the resistance born from the Sorteo, in her love for family, and the courage to be who she truly was. And at that moment, everyone began to realize this story wasn't over, and Clara was far from the victim they expected. The room fell into complete silence as the candidates displayed their colorful vases, a showcase of beauty and success shimmering under the sparkling lights. In the center of that gallery of triumphs, Clara's vase stood still, devoid of any sign of life. She was the only one without flowers, the solitary point of fragility in a sea of vibrant colors. Many expected her to crumble, to lower her head, or to shrink into a corner. But Clara did the opposite. With a straight posture and steady gaze, she held her vase with a silent dignity louder than any words could be. Clara didn't need flowers to prove her worth. Her strength was in that resistance, that courage to remain whole when everyone expected her to fall. It was as if the emptiness of the vase was a shield against the superficiality around her, a mute declaration that true value isn't in what's shown, but in what's inside. And so, before all those lights and gazes, Clara became a symbol of resistance and authenticity. The only one without flowers, yes, but also the only one who didn't sell out, didn't bow, and didn't hide. The silence in that room was heavy but carried a clear message. The game was far from over, and true beauty, the one that blooms from the soul, was yet to come. Vittoria, with a scornful smile, raised her voice and called Clara to the center of the room. "Come on, dear, show us what you've managed to grow all this time." The request sounded more like a sentence than a plea. Clara, chest tight, lifted her empty vase before all the judging eyes. The heavy silence broke into low laughs and whispered comments, soon turning into cruel insinuations about her humble origins and supposed inability. The candidates wasted no time, weaving sharp words and looks heavy with disdain. "Where is she even from? The Certeo, right? She shouldn't even be here. Do you think even her seed died of shame?" The taunts echoed through the hall, making Clara feel small in the face of that collective attack. But before the humiliation became unbearable, Lucas stepped forward, his steady voice cutting through the tension. "That's enough. Clara is not here to be humiliated. You don't understand her strength because you've never had to fight like she has." With eyes burning with indignation, Lucas defended Clara with a passion no one expected. He wasn't just protecting the woman he loved, he was exposing the hypocrisy of that toxic environment. Silence settled again, this time filled with respect and surprise. And in that moment, Clara realized that despite all attempts to bring her down, she had an unexpected ally, someone who saw beyond the empty vase to what truly mattered. After the humiliation in the hall, Lucas took Clara to the garden, where the silence and the freshness of the plants created a refuge from the chaos. He held her hand gently, feeling the pain she tried to hide behind her courage. With a sigh, he revealed a small flower already sprouted, tucked in his jacket pocket. "If you want, we can use this flower to save your image. No one needs to know your vase is empty." It was an offer full of temptation, an invitation to escape the truth. Clara looked at the flower with a mix of surprise and sadness. To her, that flower didn't represent victory, but a symbol of what she didn't want to be, a false version of herself. "Lucas," she replied firmly, "I don't want to win by hiding my truth. If the challenge is about blooming, I'd rather be honest, even if that means facing failure." At that moment, the choice between appearance and authenticity became clear, and Clara didn't hesitate to take the harder path. Lucas watched her, admiring her courage. He knew that for Clara, what mattered wasn't just the contest, but the dignity she carried even in the worst moments. The garden, a silent witness to that conversation, seemed to breathe relief. Because there, among shadows and stars, Clara showed that true worth isn't in what others see, but in what we choose to preserve in our hearts. In the calm of the night, Clara found a moment to connect with her mother, who was fighting in the hospital. Her mother's fragile voice carried a mix of strength and tenderness, as if, even sick, she wanted to pass hope to her daughter. Clara spoke carefully, trying to hide the fear tightening her chest, but also sharing dreams and promises of better days. The conversation was a thread of light in the darkness that seemed to swallow everything around. After the call, Clara went out to the garden, where the full moon cast its silver glow over the empty vase she still held. There, in the silence, She allowed herself to feel the vulnerability she didn't show others. That vase without flowers was more than a plant. It was a symbol of the moment she was living, full of uncertainties but also courage. She knew the journey was tough, and that hope, fragile as it was, needed to be nurtured patiently. As the soft breeze brushed her face, Clara thought about the future, the battles she still had to fight, and the love that kept her strong. The emptiness of the vase wasn't an end, but an open space for possibilities. And under the moonlight, she made a silent pact with herself, to keep going, to resist, to bloom, no matter how long it took. Because true strength, she discovered, is in never giving up, even when everything seems empty. The big day arrived, carrying with it an atmosphere thick with expectation and anxious whispers. One by one, the candidates paraded through the hall, displaying their vases filled with lush flowers, a spectacle of colors and fragrances that impressed everyone. Forced smiles, calculated glances. It was as if that beauty was the only criterion for victory, the sole value recognized on that stage. The crowd seemed hypnotized by the superficial display. In the middle of that symphony of colors, Clara stood firm and serene, holding her empty vase. The contrast was inevitable, almost cruel. Many averted their gaze, others whispered cruel comments, waiting to see her crumble in the face of that evidence. But Clara, once again, showed that true strength doesn't depend on what's seen. She was there for a greater purpose, even if no one else could see it. Her silence spoke louder than any flower could. Across the room, Arthur Silva watched everything with an impassive expression, like a general surveying a battlefield. His cold, calculating gaze pierced every detail, every gesture, every glance of the candidates. He knew this was more than a simple plant evaluation. It was a test of character, of endurance, of truth. And even without showing it, Arthur was beginning to realize that the outcome of this challenge could be very different from what everyone expected. With a pounding heart, Clara walked to the center of the hall, holding her empty vase as if it were an invisible trophy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady sound of her footsteps. When she stopped in front of everyone, she took a deep breath and lifted the vase with dignity. "I couldn't make my flower grow, but I took care of this seed with everything I had." There was no shame in her voice, only truth, and for a moment, the hall seemed to hesitate, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. Arthur rose from his seat, carrying the imposing posture of one who holds the authority of the unexpected. He slowly walked toward Clara, looked at the empty vase, and smiled for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning to the others, "all the seeds delivered in this challenge were previously boiled. None could have sprouted." The shock was immediate. Murmurs and confused looks spread like wildfire. What was tested here was not gardening skill, but character, honesty, clarity of soul. He paused, then pointed at Clara. And only one person passed. The mood in the hall shifted. Security cameras began showing recorded footage, candidates swapping seeds, hiding sprouts, receiving outside help. The beauty of the flowers on the tables now became proof of fraud. One by one, the masks fell. Vittoria tried to argue, but her voice no longer found support. Arthur, calm, simply watched as justice finally bloomed. And Clara, with an empty vase in her hands and a heart full of truth, became the symbol of what money and appearances could never buy. Arthur remained standing before everyone, his gaze fixed on Clara, the hall immersed in tense silence. "In a world where appearance shouts louder than truth," he said, in a deep voice, Clara was the only one who chose to remain honest. Even without guarantees, even while being humiliated, she did not sell out. Turning to her, he solemnly declared, "You are the winner. Not because you grew a flower, but because you kept the root of honesty alive." Clara could no longer hold back her tears, not out of weakness, but relief. For the first time, her truth had been recognized. Without hesitation, Lucas crossed the hall. There were no more games, no more judgments, only the certainty of someone who had already made his choice long before this day. He took Clara's hands, looked into her eyes, and with a choked voice said, "I love you, not for what you could give me but for who you are. And if you accept..." I want to spend the rest of my life by your side." The hall that once judged her now applauded. The humiliated had become an inspiration. But, as always, there was someone who couldn't stand the truth: Vittoria. Furious, she tried to intervene. "This is absurd. She fooled everyone with that pity act." But Arthur, with a swift gesture, pointed to the big screen. New footage revealed Vittoria as the mastermind behind the schemes against Clara. Swapping seeds, threatening contestants, spreading lies. The hall turned against her. She no longer had a stage, only shame. And while Vittoria walked away defeated, Clara remained there, head held high, embraced by Lucas, her heart at peace. Because in the end, the rarest flower is the one that blooms in the soul. Even after being exposed, Vittoria didn't stay quiet. Her eyes burning, her pride shattered, she hurled her final insults at Clara. "You never belonged here. You're just a manipulator who used pity to rise." But this time, Clara didn't stay silent. She stepped forward, met Vittoria's glare, and replied, without raising her voice, "I didn't have to pretend to be more than I am to earn respect. And if honesty offends you, maybe the problem was never me." Her words echoed with strength, and this time, no one laughed. There stood a complete woman, refusing to bow. Arthur, watching closely, did what had to be done. He called security and, without ceremony, ordered all contestants to leave the mansion immediately. "The competition is over, and there's no room here for masks and manipulation." Vittoria, defeated, walked out under the same stairs she once wore like armor. The hall emptied, and the silence left behind was no longer heavy, it was freeing. Clara took a deep breath. There were no victory speeches, no need for applause, just the quiet certainty that, this time, truth had not been silenced. In the now peaceful garden, Lucas and Clara sat on the same bench where they had so often talked beneath the stars. No urgent promises, no rush to marry, no pressure, just presence. He held her hand and said, "I don't care how long it takes, I want to build this slowly, with truth." She smiled. And in that simple moment, they both knew they had found something rare. Not a fairy tale ending, but the real beginning of a story where love and respect bloom together, and no one has to hide who they truly are. The next day, when the mansion was quiet and the spotlight had faded, Arthur asked to speak with Clara alone. His expression softer now, almost paternal, he revealed something that would change her life forever. "Clara, your mother and sisters won't have to worry anymore. I've taken care of everything: treatment, education, stability. I don't consider this just a gesture of gratitude, but of justice." Clara tried to reply, but the words were lost in silent tears. For the first time, the burden she'd carried since the beginning began to dissolve. But Arthur wasn't finished. Taking an envelope from his pocket, he handed her an official document. "You didn't know, but part of the land where one of our farms now stands once belonged to your great-grandparents. It was taken unjustly, decades ago." Clara's eyes widened, confused. "We investigated when I discovered your background. And now, it's being returned to you. The deed is in your name." It wasn't just wealth, it was a legacy restored. A piece of her story was coming home. Clara held the envelope as if holding a forgotten part of her identity. It wasn't about material reward, it was something much greater: recognition, respect, belonging. The girl from the Sorteo, who had arrived with a wine-stained dress and a heart full of hope, was now seen for all that she truly was. And as Lucas approached, smiling beside her, Clara understood. It wasn't the challenge that changed her, but the courage to remain who she always had been, even when everything around her told her to give up. The following morning, something extraordinary happened in the mansion's gardens. As if orchestrated by divine hands, every flower in every corner began to bloom at the same time. It wasn't spring, and there was no sign it was coming. Nature seemed to have chosen that exact moment to flourish, as if responding in unison to the truth that had finally triumphed. The gardeners froze in disbelief. Even the few guests who remained stepped closer, enchanted. One of the oldest housemaids, Donna Nair, watched the scene with teary eyes. When love is true, Even the earth can feel it, she whispered, her voice full of emotion. I've seen a lot in this house. But this? This is a sign. No one dared laugh or disagree. It was as if the entire garden knew Clara hadn't just won a challenge. She had restored the purity of a place lost to vanity. That synchronization of nature felt more spiritual than botanical. And everyone sensed it, even if they couldn't explain why. Clara walked among the flowers with Lucas at her side, as if treading through a dream. There were no more doubts, no need to prove anything. The flowers, so alive now, seemed to have waited for her. And in that unlikely setting, where once there was only suspicion and competition, something new bloomed. A kind of love that doesn't need to shout to be heard. A kind of truth that, even trampled, always finds a way to bloom, at the right time, in the right way, with roots deep and everlasting. Night fell like a soft veil over the now flourishing garden. Beneath a sky dusted with stars, Clara and Lucas took their first steps in an improvised waltz. There were no musicians, no audience, just the gentle sound of wind through the leaves and two hearts beating in rhythm. Clara's feet moved as if they were born for that moment. It was a dance without rules, without hurry, where every step was guided by the certainty of a love built on truth. It wasn't a fairy tale scene, it was more beautiful than that, because it was real. Seated beneath a trellis, Donna Teresa, now stronger and in treatment, watched her daughter with tearful eyes. For so long, she had dreamed of seeing Clara far from poverty, not just with food and shelter, but respected, loved, valued. And there she was, her girl, dancing with a man who saw her through the right eyes. The emotion was so overwhelming that Donna Teresa placed a hand over her heart and whispered, "She made it. And she didn't even need flowers to win." The tears that followed weren't of pain, but of gratitude. The garden, once a witness to so many tears and humiliations, now welcomed a new chapter. The real prize wasn't in the inherited lands or the status gained, but in that embrace where respect, partnership, and freedom lived. Clara didn't need to prove anything anymore. She had crossed the desert of falsehood with feet firmly planted in honesty. And in that gentle spin of the waltz, surrounded by flowers that finally bloomed, a future opened up, not perfect but pure. A home built not on appearances, but on love.